John Carter walked into the courtroom, his boots clicking softly against the tiled floor. The room was small, with wooden benches that creaked under the weight of those sitting on them. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the space. People filled every available seat, some curious bystanders, others reporters eager to capture the drama. John stood out among them, not because of his height or appearance, but because of the quiet strength he carried. His face was lined with age and experience, each wrinkle telling a story of battles fought both overseas and at home. He wasn't there for glory or recognition. He was there because he believed in something bigger than himself. The case had started months earlier, sparked by an incident during a peaceful protest in the city square. John, now retired from military service, had joined the demonstration to support a cause close to his heart: better treatment for veterans struggling to reintegrate into civilian life. What began as a day of solidarity quickly turned chaotic when tensions flared between protesters and law enforcement. Someone threw a rock. Shouts echoed through the streets. In the confusion, John found himself at the center of accusations he couldn't comprehend. Witnesses claimed he had incited violence, though nothing could have been further from the truth. For John, it was about standing up for what was right, not tearing anything down. As the trial progressed, it became clear this wasn't just about one man's actions. It was about power, perception, and who got to decide which voices mattered. The prosecution painted John as reckless, someone who used his past as a shield while disregarding the rules of society. They presented shaky evidence, grainy photos, hearsay, and conflicting accounts, all aimed at discrediting him. But what hurt most was how they twisted his intentions. To them, John wasn't a patriot or a concerned citizen. He was a troublemaker, a relic of wars long past, unfit for modern times. Each accusation felt like a punch to the gut, yet John refused to let anger cloud his judgment. He knew the truth would eventually come to light, if only he could hold on long enough. Sitting beside him, his lawyer scribbled notes furiously, occasionally whispering words of encouragement. "Stay calm," she urged under her breath. "We'll get through this." But staying calm wasn't easy when the world seemed determined to misunderstand you. John glanced around the room, taking in the sea of faces watching him. Some looked sympathetic, nodding slightly as if to say, "We're rooting for you." Others stared blankly, their expressions unreadable. And then there were those who sneered, clearly convinced of his guilt before hearing all the facts. It was hard not to feel overwhelmed, surrounded by so many opinions, none of which truly grasped the complexity of his situation. The judge presiding over the case was a stern man in his late 50s, with sharp features and an even sharper demeanor. From the moment proceedings began, he made it clear he wouldn't tolerate delays or emotional appeals. Every time John tried to explain his side, the judge cut him off, reminding him to stick to the facts. "This isn't a platform for your beliefs," he said once, his voice cold and authoritative. Those words stung, but John bit back any retort. He understood the importance of following protocol, even if it felt unfair. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something vital was being lost in translation, that no one was listening to what really mattered. Despite the mounting pressure, John held on to hope. He thought about the men and women he'd served alongside, the sacrifices they'd made, and the promises they'd kept. Many of them hadn't returned home, while others struggled daily with invisible wounds. John often wondered why fate had spared him when so many others hadn't been as fortunate. Maybe this was his chance to honor their memories, to fight not just for himself but for everyone who'd ever felt silenced or overlooked. That thought gave him courage, even as doubt crept in at the edges of his mind. Back home, John lived a simple life. His house was modest, filled with mementos from his years in the military, photos, medals, letters from comrades. Neighbors knew him as a quiet man who kept to himself, though he always greeted them warmly. Few realized the depth of his convictions or the fire burning within him. To most, he was just another veteran trying to make ends meet. But inside, John wrestled with questions that haunted him. Had his service meant anything? Was anyone paying attention to the issues he cared about? These doubts gnawed at him, especially now, as he faced a system that seemed intent on dismissing him. On the morning of the trial, John woke early, unable to sleep. He dressed carefully, choosing clothes that reflected both his respect for the court and his identity as a soldier. As he drove to the courthouse, the streets were eerily quiet, bathed in the soft glow of dawn. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to imagine a different outcome, one where justice prevailed, where people listened, and where his voice didn't fall on deaf ears. But reality quickly set in as he parked and stepped out of his car. Reporters swarmed him immediately, shoving microphones in his face and shouting questions he didn't have time to answer. Cameras flashed, capturing his every move, turning him into a spectacle before the day had even begun. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Everyone waited anxiously for the next development, unsure of what to expect. John took his seat, gripping the edge of the table tightly. His knuckles turned white, but his expression remained steady. He reminded himself why he was there, not for vengeance or personal gain, but for the sake of truth. If nothing else, he wanted to leave knowing he'd done everything in his power to set the record straight. Little did he know, the events unfolding, that day would change far more than just his own life. They would spark conversations, challenge perceptions, and ignite movements he couldn't yet foresee. All he could do was take a deep breath, look ahead, and prepare for whatever came next. As the trial moved forward, the prosecution continued to build its case against John. They called witness after witness, each one recounting their version of events from that chaotic day in the city square. Some were clear and confident in their statements, while others stumbled over their words, unsure of what they had actually seen. One man claimed he heard John shouting aggressively at the crowd, urging them to act out. Another said she saw him throw something, though she couldn't remember exactly what it was. The stories didn't always match up, but the prosecutor skillfully wove them together into a narrative designed to paint John as dangerous and reckless. John listened intently, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He wanted to speak, to explain that none of it was true, that he had been there to support peace, not violence, but his lawyer had warned him to stay silent unless absolutely necessary. Interrupting or reacting too strongly could only harm his case. So instead, he sat quietly, letting the accusations wash over him like waves crashing against a shore. Each new testimony felt like another weight pressing down on his chest, making it harder to breathe. Yet despite the mounting pressure, John refused to let despair take hold. Deep down, he believed the truth would eventually shine through, even if it took time. The defense team wasn't idle either. John's lawyer worked tirelessly, cross-examining witnesses and pointing out inconsistencies in their accounts. She highlighted how vague some of the details were, asking pointed questions that forced people to admit they weren't entirely sure of what they'd seen. At one point, she managed to get the man who accused John of shouting to admit he hadn't actually looked directly at him during the protest. "You're basing your entire statement on assumptions, aren't you?" she asked calmly, her tone sharp yet composed. The witness hesitated before nodding, and a murmur rippled through the courtroom. It was a small victory, but it gave John a glimmer of hope. Still, the judge remained stern and unyielding. Every time the defense tried to introduce evidence supporting John's innocence, objections were raised, and more often than not, the judge sided with the prosecution. Documents showing John's history of peaceful activism were deemed irrelevant. Testimonies from fellow veterans attesting to his character were dismissed as biased. Even photographs proving John had been standing far from the source of the disturbance were ruled inadmissible. Frustration simmered beneath the surface, not just for John and his lawyer, but for everyone watching who believed fairness should be the cornerstone of justice. At one particularly tense moment, John leaned toward his lawyer and whispered, "Do you think anyone really cares about the truth?" His voice was low, almost defeated, but his eyes searched hers for reassurance. She placed a hand gently on his arm and replied, "We do, and that's all that matters right now." Her words were simple, but they carried weight. For a brief second, John allowed himself to feel a flicker of comfort. He glanced around the room again, noticing the faces of those who had come to support him. There was Sarah, a neighbor who always brought him fresh baked bread on Sundays. Across the aisle sat Marcus, an old friend from his military days, wearing his uniform jacket as a sign of solidarity. These people mattered. They reminded John he wasn't alone, but not everyone in the courtroom shared their compassion. Some spectators whispered behind cupped hands, casting judgmental glances in John's direction. Others openly rolled their eyes when the defense presented arguments they found unconvincing. A young woman sitting near the front scribbled furiously in a notebook, occasionally looking up to study John with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Whether she was a reporter or simply someone intrigued by the drama, John couldn't tell. What he did notice was the way her pen paused whenever the prosecution made a strong point, as though she were waiting for him to crack under the pressure. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as the hours ticked by. Witnesses came and went. Lawyers argued back and forth, and the pile of papers on the judge's desk grew taller. Outside, the sun climbed higher in the sky, its light shifting across the room in slow, golden arcs. Inside, the air grew heavier, thick with tension and anticipation. John shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his muscles stiff from sitting so long. He reached for the glass of water in front of him, sipping slowly to steady his nerves. Each sip felt like a lifeline, grounding him in the present moment when everything else threatened to spiral out of control. Just when it seemed the prosecution might wrap up their case, they introduced one final witness, a police officer who had been present at the protest. Tall and broad-shouldered, the officer strode confidently to the stand, his uniform crisp and polished. As he recounted his version of events, his tone was authoritative, leaving little room for doubt. According to him, John had been at the center of the chaos, refusing orders to disperse and inciting others to resist arrest. The courtroom fell silent as he spoke, his words carrying an undeniable weight. For the first time that day, John felt a pang of uncertainty creep into his mind. Could this man's testimony sway the jury? Was it possible no one would believe him? When it was finally the defense's turn to question the officer, John's lawyer approached the stand with determination etched on her face. She began by asking seemingly innocuous questions, probing for details about the officer's position during the protest. Slowly but surely, cracks began to appear in his story. When pressed, he admitted he hadn't personally witnessed John throwing anything or shouting incendiary remarks. Instead, he relied on information passed along by other officers, information that couldn't be verified. The shift was subtle but significant. By the time the questioning ended, the officer's confidence had visibly waned, and murmurs of disbelief spread among the audience. Though the session drew to a close shortly afterward, the day's events left an indelible mark on everyone involved. John walked out of the courthouse feeling both drained and cautiously optimistic. Progress had been made, however slight, and he clung to that knowledge like a lifeline. As he stepped into the late afternoon sunlight, reporters once again surrounded him, firing off rapid-fire questions about the trial. This time, though, John allowed himself a small smile. "I trust the truth will come out," he said simply, his voice steady and calm. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving the crowd buzzing with speculation. Back home, John spent the evening reflecting on the day's twists and turns. He replayed key moments in his mind, analyzing what had gone well and what challenges still lay ahead. Though exhaustion tugged at him, he couldn't bring himself to rest. Instead, he pulled out an old photo album and flipped through its pages, revisiting memories of his time in the military. Each picture brought back a flood of emotions: camaraderie, pride, sorrow. As he stared at the faces of friends long gone, John felt a renewed sense of purpose. If nothing else, he owed it to them to keep fighting, not just for himself, but for the values they had all stood for. Whatever happened next, he vowed to face it head-on, with courage and integrity guiding his every step. The next morning, John arrived at the courthouse early, hoping to gather his thoughts before the day's proceedings began. He stood outside for a moment, watching the city wake up around him. Cars honked in the distance, pedestrians hurried past with coffee cups in hand, and birds chirped softly from nearby trees. It was a scene of normalcy, so far removed from the tension brewing inside the courtroom. Taking a deep breath, John adjusted his tie and stepped through the heavy wooden doors. The air inside was cool and still, a stark contrast to the chaos of the previous day. He found his seat and waited, his mind racing with possibilities. As the trial resumed, the defense called their first witness, a fellow veteran named Tom Reynolds. Tom had served alongside John in the military and knew him better than most. When he took the stand, his presence commanded attention. Dressed in a neatly pressed suit, he carried himself with quiet dignity. His testimony began with memories of their time together overseas, painting a picture of John as a man of honor and integrity. John was always the one looking out for others, Tom said, his voice steady and sincere. He never shied away from doing what was right, even when it was hard. The jury listened intently, some nodding along as if they could see glimpses of the man Tom described. But the prosecution wasn't about to let such a glowing portrayal go unchallenged. During cross-examination, they grilled Tom on whether he had been present at the protest. When he admitted he hadn't been there, they seized the opportunity to undermine his credibility. "So you're basing your entire testimony on hearsay?" the prosecutor asked sharply, leaning forward for emphasis. Tom didn't flinch. "I'm basing it on years of knowing John," he replied firmly, "and I know he wouldn't do what you're accusing him of." The exchange left the courtroom buzzing, with supporters nodding approvingly and skeptics raising eyebrows. After Tom's testimony came another pivotal moment, the introduction of video footage from the protest. John's lawyer had spent weeks tracking down recordings from various angles, hoping to prove that John had been unfairly targeted. When the lights dimmed and the screen flickered to life, all eyes turned to the grainy images playing out before them. The footage showed snippets of the crowd, police officers shouting orders, and people scattering in different directions. At one point, John appeared briefly in the frame, standing near the edge of the gathering. His body language was calm, his hands at his sides. There was no sign of aggression or incitement, just a man observing the scene unfolding around him. The impact of the video was immediate. Gasps rippled through the audience as people realized how misleading earlier testimonies had been. Even the judge leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable but undeniably focused. The prosecution tried to downplay its significance, arguing that the footage didn't capture everything and couldn't be trusted as definitive proof. But the damage had been done. Doubts began to creep into the minds of those who had once been convinced of John's guilt. For John, it was a small triumph, a crack in the wall of skepticism that had surrounded him since the trial began. Despite this progress, the prosecution wasn't ready to concede. They shifted tactics, focusing instead on portraying John as someone who harbored resentment toward authority. They brought up old interviews where he had criticized government policies affecting veterans, twisting his words to suggest he had a vendetta. "Isn't it true you've publicly disagreed with law enforcement practices?" the prosecutor asked during John's turn on the stand. John hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Yes, I've spoken out when I felt policies were unfair," he admitted. "But disagreement isn't the same as hostility. I believe in constructive dialogue, not conflict." His answer earned nods of approval from some in the audience while others remained unconvinced. The prosecutor pressed harder, trying to poke holes in John's reasoning. "So you admit you don't always agree with the rules?" he shot back. "How can we trust you to follow them?" John met his gaze steadily. "Following rules doesn't mean blindly accepting injustice," he said. "It means holding ourselves accountable to higher standards." The courtroom fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Even the judge paused, pen hovering above his notepad, as if considering the implications. Throughout the day, emotions ran high. Supporters cheered quietly after each favorable development, while detractors muttered under their breath. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing every detail for their stories. Outside, social media buzzed with reactions, hashtags trending as people debated the fairness of the trial. Some argued that John was being persecuted for speaking his mind, while others insisted he should face consequences if he'd truly broken the law. Amidst the noise, John stayed focused, reminding himself why he was there. This wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about standing up for principles bigger than any one person. By late afternoon, fatigue settled over the courtroom like a heavy blanket. Lawyers shuffled papers, jurors rubbed tired eyes, and spectators shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Just as everyone thought the session might wrap up, the judge made an unexpected announcement. "Before we adjourn," he said, his voice cutting through the room, "I want to remind everyone that this court operates on facts, not opinions." He glanced pointedly at John as he spoke, a subtle reminder of the earlier reprimand. The comment stung, but John forced himself to remain composed. He understood the importance of staying respectful, even when respect wasn't reciprocated. When the day ended, John stepped outside to find a small group of supporters waiting for him. Among them was Sarah, the neighbor who often brought him fresh-baked bread. She held up a loaf wrapped in brown paper, smiling warmly. "For strength," she said simply, pressing it into his hands. Others offered words of encouragement, thanking him for fighting the good fight. Their kindness buoyed John's spirits, reminding him that he wasn't alone. As he walked home, the bread tucked safely under his arm, he reflected on the day's events. Progress had been slow and incremental, but it was progress nonetheless. That evening, John sat at his kitchen table, flipping through notes from the trial. He jotted down thoughts and observations, preparing for whatever challenges lay ahead. Though exhaustion tugged at him, he couldn't stop thinking about the road ahead. Each step felt like climbing a mountain, steep and grueling, but the summit kept calling to him. He thought about the faces of those who had supported him, their smiles, their encouraging words, and drew strength from their belief in him. If nothing else, he owed it to them to keep going, to push through the doubt and fear until the truth finally prevailed. As he drifted off to sleep, John allowed himself a moment of quiet optimism. Tomorrow would bring new battles, new hurdles to overcome. But for now, he rested, knowing he had given his all, and that the fight was far from over. Whatever happened next, he vowed to face it with the same resolve that had carried him this far. After all, he wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for everyone who believed in justice, fairness, and the power of speaking truth to power. And that, he realized, was worth every ounce of effort. The fourth day of the trial began with a heaviness that seemed to settle over the courtroom like a storm cloud. John arrived early, his steps slower than usual, weighed down by the mounting pressure. He had barely slept the night before, his mind replaying every moment of the trial so far. Each accusation, each skeptical glance from the jury, lingered in his thoughts. Yet when he entered the room, he straightened his shoulders and squared his jaw. No matter how daunting the battle felt, he refused to let anyone see him falter. As the session opened, the defense team called their next witness, a local activist named Rachel Mendez. She had been at the protest that day, standing near John and observing the chaos unfold. Rachel was younger than many of the other witnesses, her energy palpable as she took the stand. Dressed in simple clothes, she carried herself with confidence, her eyes scanning the room briefly before settling on the judge. Her testimony painted a vivid picture of the scene, the swelling crowd, the growing tension, and the sudden eruption of disorder. When asked about John's role, she spoke clearly and without hesitation. "He wasn't causing trouble," she said. "In fact, he was trying to calm people down." Her words sent ripples through the courtroom. Supporters nodded approvingly, while skeptics leaned forward, scrutinizing her every expression. The prosecution quickly moved to challenge her account, questioning her motives and suggesting she might be biased due to her involvement in the protest. "Aren't you also critical of law enforcement?" they asked pointedly. Rachel didn't flinch. "Yes, I've spoken out against policies I disagree with," she admitted. "But that doesn't mean I lie under oath. I'm here because I saw what happened, and it's important to tell the truth." Her calm demeanor disarmed even the toughest questions, leaving the prosecution visibly frustrated. Despite Rachel's compelling testimony, the prosecution doubled down on their narrative. They introduced new evidence, a grainy photo allegedly showing John holding an object in his hand. The prosecutor held it up dramatically, asking the jury to examine it closely. "Does this look like someone who was simply observing?" he demanded, his voice rising. John's lawyer immediately objected, arguing that the image was too unclear to draw any conclusions. The judge agreed, dismissing the photo as inconclusive, but the damage was done. Whispers spread among the audience, some leaning toward doubt, while others dismissed the photo as irrelevant. John sat silently through it all, gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. He wanted to stand up and shout, to explain that the object in question was nothing more than a water bottle he'd been holding for a fellow protester. But he knew better than to interrupt. Doing so would only play into the prosecution's hands. Instead, he focused on breathing deeply, reminding himself to stay patient. Justice, he told himself, wasn't always swift, but it could still be fair if given a chance. Later that morning, the defense presented another key piece of evidence: text messages exchanged between John and several friends leading up to the Yo protest. These messages revealed his intentions: to peacefully support veterans' rights, not incite violence. One message read, "I'll be there to show solidarity, not to cause trouble." Another urged caution, reminding everyone to remain respectful and avoid confrontation. The texts were straightforward, offering a clear glimpse into John's mindset. As they were displayed on a screen for the court to see, murmurs of approval rippled through the room. The prosecution tried to dismiss the texts as rehearsed or fabricated, but their arguments lacked conviction. Even the judge appeared unimpressed, his pen moving steadily across his notepad as he jotted down notes. For the first time in days, a sense of momentum shifted in favor of the defense. John allowed himself a small, fleeting smile, though he quickly masked it with a neutral expression. He knew better than to celebrate prematurely. The fight was far from over. By early afternoon, tensions reached a boiling point. The prosecution called their final witness, a forensic expert tasked with analyzing video footage from the protest. Armed with charts and technical jargon, the expert claimed to identify subtle movements in John's body language that suggested aggression. "His posture indicates intent," the expert stated confidently, pointing to freeze frames projected onto a large screen. To the untrained eye, the analysis seemed convincing, but John's lawyer wasted no time dismantling it. During cross-examination, she highlighted inconsistencies in the expert's methodology, forcing him to admit that such interpretations were subjective at best. The exchange left the courtroom buzzing with debate. Some spectators whispered excitedly, convinced the tide was turning in John's favor. Others remained cautious, unwilling to jump to conclusions. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing every twist and turn for their stories. Outside, social media erupted once again, hashtags trending as people dissected the latest developments. Opinions clashed fiercely, with some hailing John as a hero and others condemning him as guilty beyond doubt. Amidst the noise, John stayed grounded, focusing on the task at hand rather than the whirlwind surrounding him. As the day wore on, exhaustion became evident on everyone's faces, including the judge's. His patience grew thin, and he frequently reminded both sides to stick to relevant points. At one particularly tense moment, he turned to John directly, repeating his earlier warning. "Mr. Carter, remember that this is a court of law, not a platform for your beliefs." The comment stung, hitting a nerve that had already been raw for days. John clenched his fists beneath the table, resisting the urge to respond. Instead, he met the judge's gaze calmly, letting the silence speak for itself. It was a small act of defiance, but it carried weight. When the session finally adjourned, John stepped outside to find cameras flashing and reporters shouting questions. He ignored them, keeping his head down as he made his way to his car. Inside, he gripped the steering wheel tightly, taking a moment to collect himself. The day had been grueling, filled with highs and lows that left him emotionally drained. Yet amidst the chaos, he felt a flicker of hope. Progress, however incremental, was being made. People were starting to listen, not just to the facts, but to the larger message behind them. That evening, John returned home to find Marcus waiting for him. His old friend had brought dinner, setting up a makeshift picnic on the living room floor. They ate quietly at first, savoring the comfort of familiar company. Eventually, Marcus broke the silence. "How are you holding up?" he asked gently. John shrugged, picking at his food. "It's tough," he admitted, "but I can't give up now. Not when we're so close to proving the truth." Marcus nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You've always been stronger than you think," he said. "And you're not alone in this. We're all rooting for you." Their conversation stretched, late into the night, covering everything from childhood memories to shared dreams for the future. By the time Marcus left, John felt a renewed sense of purpose. He realized that this fight wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about standing firm in the face of adversity, about proving that integrity mattered. As he prepared for bed, he glanced at the photo album sitting on his desk. Flipping it open, he paused at a picture of himself and his comrades during their military days. Their smiles were bright, full of hope and camaraderie. In that moment, John vowed to honor their legacy, not by giving in to despair, but by continuing to fight for justice. Though the road ahead remained uncertain, John drifted off to sleep with quiet determination. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own battles to face. But for now, he rested, knowing he had given his all, and that the truth was worth every ounce of effort. Whatever happened next, he resolved to face it with courage, guided by the belief that speaking up, even when it was hard, was always the right thing to do. The fifth day of the trial began with a sense of anticipation that filled the courtroom. People arrived early, eager to see how events would unfold. Reporters jostled for better seats, their notebooks and recording devices ready. John entered, quietly, his face calm but his eyes sharp, scanning the room as if memorizing every detail. He knew this was a critical day, one where the defense planned to present its closing arguments and make a final push for justice. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on him, yet he carried it with quiet determination. As the session opened, John's lawyer stood up, her presence commanding attention. She started by summarizing the key points of the case, weaving them into a narrative that painted John not as a troublemaker, but as a man of principle who had been unfairly targeted. Her voice was steady and clear, each word chosen carefully to resonate with the jury. "This isn't just about one man," she said, pausing for effect. "It's about what we value as a society: truth, fairness, and the courage to speak out when things are wrong." The courtroom fell silent, everyone leaning in slightly to catch every word. She revisited the evidence piece by piece, highlighting inconsistencies in the prosecution's case. She reminded the jury of Rachel's testimony, the video footage showing John's peaceful demeanor, and the text messages proving his good intentions. Then she addressed the accusations head-on, dismantling them with logic and precision. "They've tried to twist facts and manipulate perceptions," she said firmly. "But the truth is simple. John Carter didn't incite violence. He was there to support a cause he believes in, a cause many of us share." Her closing statement shifted from facts to emotion, appealing directly to the jury's humanity. She spoke about the struggles veterans face when they return home, the challenges of reintegrating into civilian life, and the importance of standing up for those who have served. "John fought for our freedom," she said, her voice softening. "Now we must decide whether we'll honor that sacrifice or turn our backs on it." The impact was undeniable. Some jurors exchanged glances, others nodded thoughtfully, and a few even wiped tears from their eyes. When the prosecution took the floor, their tone was defiant. They reiterated their claims, focusing heavily on the idea that John's actions, or alleged lack thereof, didn't matter as much as his intentions. "Disagreement with authority isn't a crime," the prosecutor admitted, "but encouraging unrest is, and that's exactly what happened here." Their argument relied less on concrete evidence and more on emotional appeals, painting John as someone whose ideals posed a threat to order. Yet despite their efforts, cracks were beginning to show. The repeated reliance on vague testimonies and circumstantial evidence made their case feel weaker, almost desperate. Throughout the back and forth, John remained composed, though his mind raced. He watched the jury closely, searching for any sign of how they might be swayed. Were they listening to the defense's logical breakdown of events, or were they clinging to the prosecution's portrayal of him as dangerous? It was impossible to tell, and that uncertainty gnawed at him. Still, he reminded himself of something Marcus had said the night before. You can't control what others think. All you can do is stay true to yourself. Those words gave him strength, grounding him in the present moment. After both sides finished their arguments, the judge instructed the jury to begin deliberations. As they filed out of the room, John felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety. The waiting game had begun, and there was nothing he could do but sit tight. Supporters approached him during the break, offering kind words and reassurance. Sarah handed him another loaf of bread, this time still warm from the oven. For patience, she said with a smile. John thanked her, touched by her thoughtfulness. Even strangers stopped to shake his hand or pat him on the back, telling him they believed in his innocence. Hours passed, stretching into what felt like an eternity. John paced the hallway outside the courtroom, his steps measured but restless. His lawyer joined him occasionally, sharing updates or simply keeping him company. Jury deliberations can take time, she reminded him gently. Try not to overthink it. Easier said than done, John thought wryly. Every tick of the clock seemed louder than the last, amplifying the tension in the air. He found himself replaying the trial in his mind, wondering if he should have said more or acted differently. But deep down, he knew he'd done everything he could. Finally, late in the afternoon, the jury returned. The courtroom buzzed with nervous energy as everyone took their seats. John sat upright, his hands clasped tightly together. The foreperson stood, holding a slip of paper that felt heavier than it looked. When the verdict was read, not guilty, a wave of emotion swept through the room. Gasps erupted from the audience, followed by cheers and applause. John sat frozen for a moment, unable to process what had just happened. Then slowly reality sank in. He turned to his lawyer, who was smiling broadly, and managed a shaky grin. In return, the judge addressed the court briefly, reminding everyone that the verdict didn't mean the issues raised during the trial weren't important. Free speech is a cornerstone of our democracy, he said, his tone unusually reflective. But it comes with responsibility. Though the comment stung slightly, John chose to focus on the bigger picture. He had been vindicated, not just legally, but morally. The truth had prevailed, and that was worth celebrating. Outside the courthouse, chaos erupted as reporters scrambled to get quotes from John and his supporters. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust forward, and questions flew faster than he could answer them. For the first time in days, John allowed himself to smile openly. I'm grateful for the support I've received, he said, his voice steady despite the noise. This wasn't just about me, it was about standing up for what's right, and I hope this encourages others to do the same. As the crowd dispersed, John lingered for a moment, soaking in the significance of what had happened. Friends and neighbors surrounded him, congratulating him and expressing pride in his resilience. Marcus clapped him on the shoulder, grinning ear to ear. You did it, buddy, he said. You showed them what real courage looks like. John nodded, humbled by the praise but aware that the journey wasn't entirely over. Winning the trial was one thing. Ensuring lasting change was another. That evening, John returned home to find his house decorated with balloons and banners. Someone, likely Sarah, had organized a small celebration, complete with food and drinks. Neighbors gathered in his living room, laughing and chatting as if the weight of the past weeks had lifted. John mingled among them, thanking each person individually for their support. Though he appreciated the gesture, part of him longed for quiet reflection. After excusing himself, he stepped onto the porch, breathing in the cool night air. Sitting in the dim light, John reflected on everything he'd been through. The trial had tested him in ways he never imagined, forcing him to confront doubts, fears, and frustrations. but it had also shown him the power of community, the importance of perseverance, and the enduring value of speaking truth to power. As he gazed up at the stars, he felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for the outcome, but for the lessons learned along the way. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to continue advocating for veterans and other causes, close to his heart. But for now, John allowed himself to rest, knowing he had fought the good fight and emerged stronger because of it. Whatever lay ahead, he resolved to face it with the same courage and integrity that had brought him this far. In the days following the trial, John's life began to change in ways he hadn't anticipated. The verdict had sparked a wave of attention that swept far beyond the courtroom walls. Local newspapers ran headlines celebrating his acquittal, while national outlets picked up the story, framing it as a triumph for free speech and justice. Social media buzzed with hashtags like Tong Stand with John and Tong Truth Prevails, turning him into an unlikely symbol of resilience. Strangers reached out with messages of support, sharing their own stories of struggle and perseverance. For John, it was overwhelming, but also humbling. He realized that his fight wasn't just about him anymore. It had become something bigger, a rallying cry for others who felt silenced or overlooked. Despite the newfound fame, John stayed grounded. He returned to his routine, waking early each morning to tend to his garden and take long walks around the neighborhood. These quiet moments allowed him to process everything that had happened. At times he found himself replaying the trial in his mind, reliving the tension, the victories, and the setbacks. But more often than not, he focused on what lay ahead. Winning the case was one thing. Ensuring its impact lasted was another. He knew the issues he cared about, veterans' rights, accountability, and civic engagement, needed ongoing effort, and he was determined to keep pushing forward. One afternoon, a letter arrived in the mail. It was from a young soldier named Emily, stationed overseas. She wrote about how John's story had inspired her and her fellow troops. "We see you standing up for us," she said, "and it reminds us why we serve." Enclosed was a small American flag they had signed, each name written carefully in ink. Holding the flag in his hands, John felt a lump rise in his throat. This was why he had fought so hard, not for recognition, but to remind people that service and sacrifice mattered. That evening, he pinned the flag to his wall, where it hung proudly alongside photos of his comrades. The invitations started coming soon after. Universities asked him to speak at commencement ceremonies. Community groups invited him to lead discussions on activism, and veterans organizations wanted him to join panels advocating for policy changes. At first, John hesitated. Public speaking had never been his strong suit, and he worried about saying the wrong thing. But Marcus encouraged him, reminding him of the power of his voice. "You don't have to be perfect," Marcus said. "Just be honest. People connect with authenticity." With that advice in mind, John accepted a few offers, starting small and working his way up. His first talk was at a local high school. Standing in front of a room full of teenagers, John felt nervous, but resolved. He began by sharing his journey, not just the trial, but the years leading up to it. He talked about serving in the military, the camaraderie he cherished, and the challenges of returning home. Then he opened up about the protest and the trial, explaining how speaking up, even when it was scary, could make a difference. By the time he finished, the students were on their feet, applauding loudly. Some approached him afterward, asking questions or thanking him for his courage. One girl even handed him a note that read, "You've made me believe I can change the world." As word spread, John's schedule filled with more engagements. He traveled to different cities, meeting people from all walks of life. In Chicago, he spoke to a group of veterans struggling with PTSD, offering words of hope and solidarity. In New York, he addressed a crowd of activists, urging them to stay committed to their causes despite obstacles. Each event deepened his understanding of the challenges facing society and reinforced his belief in the importance of standing firm in one's values. Though the pace was exhausting, John found joy in connecting with others and seeing the ripple effects of his efforts. Back home, John continued to advocate for change on a personal level. He worked closely with Sarah and other neighbors to organize fundraisers for struggling veterans. They held bake sales, car washes, and charity runs, raising money to provide housing assistance and mental health resources. John also partnered with local schools to teach students about civic responsibility. He visited classrooms, sharing stories of teamwork and leadership, and encouraged young people to get involved in their communities. "Change starts with you," he often said. "Don't wait for someone else to fix things. Be the person who steps up." Over time, John's influence extended beyond his immediate circle. Lawmakers took notice of his advocacy, inviting him to testify before committees focused on veteran affairs. His testimony was straightforward and heartfelt, drawing on both his experiences and the stories others had shared with him. "We owe it to those who serve to do better," he told the legislators, "not just with words but with action." His remarks resonated deeply, prompting several representatives to propose new bills aimed at improving support systems for veterans. Though progress was slow, John remained optimistic, knowing that meaningful change rarely happened overnight. Years passed, and John's legacy only grew stronger. Schools included excerpts from his speeches in curriculums, teaching students the value of integrity and perseverance. Veterans groups honored him annually, presenting awards named after him to individuals making significant contributions to their communities. Even the courthouse where his trial had taken place erected a plaque commemorating the historic verdict, a reminder of the day truth triumphed over doubt. For John, these honors weren't about personal glory. They were proof that his efforts had sparked something lasting. Looking back on his journey, John often reflected on the judge's words during the trial. "Keep your opinions to yourself." Those words had stung at the time, but now they seemed almost ironic. Far from silencing him, they had fueled his determination to make his voice heard. What had started as a legal battle had evolved into a movement, one that inspired countless others to stand up for what they believed in. John knew he wasn't perfect. He still doubted himself sometimes, still questioned whether he was doing enough. But he also knew this: silence was never the answer. On a crisp autumn morning, John stood in his garden, watching the sun rise over the horizon. The air smelled of earth and fresh beginnings, and the trees swayed gently in the breeze. He thought about the road he'd traveled, the battles fought, the friendships forged, and the lives touched along the way. He didn't consider himself a hero. He was just a man who had refused to stay quiet when it mattered most. As he sipped his coffee, he smiled softly, feeling a profound sense of peace. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he was ready to face them, with courage, with purpose, and with the unwavering belief that speaking the truth was always worth it.